Xcom Chimera Squad is a turn-based tactical game developed by Firaxis Games and is a spin-off, not a sequel, but a spin-off to the very successful Xcom series. So this took everyone by surprise because pretty much a couple of weeks ago they announced this game was coming out, and then about a week or so later the game came out. I don't think anyone was expecting a new XCOM game, let alone a spin-off. But I think for me and many others, we were expecting XCOM 3 to maybe be announced this year and maybe come out towards the end of the year or perhaps next year. But definitely weren't expecting a spin-off or an XCOM 2.5, if you want to call it that. So in XCOM Chimera Squad, it is set a couple of years after the events of XCOM 2. And in Chimera Squad, you control a mixture of aliens and humans working together in sort of a police task force, going around the city in a city called City 31 and solving crimes in XCOM way, which usually means shooting the place up most of the time, but you are dealing with incidents around the city, responding to things happening. Let's talk about the look of this game, because immediately that's probably going to be the first thing you notice in terms of a difference between XCOM 2 and XCOM Chimera Squad. In Chimera Squad, they've gone for the more cartoonish kind of feel. Like the graphics alone, you know, gameplay-wise, they are the same as XCOM 2. There's nothing really drastic they've done there. But in terms of the cutscenes, they're replaced with drawings or still images, and they're just more of a Saturday morning cartoon feel to the whole thing, especially in the cutscenes. And of course, this being a spin-off, it's going to look and feel different, especially, and I don't really like to bring this into question because it's not really going to affect my review score either way, and this goes for all games I review. But the price of this game is about a quarter of what you expect an XCOM, like a full proper release XCOM game to be. So obviously there's going to be changes, and there perhaps is experimentation in this as well that they may include for XCOM 3 to see if it works out. That's kind of the way I look at Chimera Squad, is there's a lot of new things added in here, and there's a lot of changes from the previous XCOM, and I believe that they're just trying out a couple of features that may or may not work in this game, and they'll obviously see if they could try and incorporate them into XCOM 3 when that gets released. That's what I personally feel like. For me, XCOM 2 and XCOM 1, I would say, they had a dark, gritty feel to the whole thing. There was always a case of, yes, you're shooting aliens, and it kind of doesn't look realistic, I would say, graphics-wise, and especially being panicky in missions, that sort of dreaded fear that you may lose this soldier or these couple of soldiers that are really, really well trained and they've been with you forever. That's what these XCOM games truly means to me, is that you end up creating a bond over time with these characters that don't really talk that much, actually. They're just there, but you sort of have a weird sense of, I don't know, responsibility for them. Obviously, you're the commander of them, but at the same time, you probably have favorites that you pick out because you spend so long with these characters who are not really characters. They're just people you make, but they're yours, and that's what makes it feel special. So, XCOM Chimera Squad doesn't have this. In fact, the characters you play as are all predetermined. Their powers are predetermined. They are characters. They're focusing this time more on characters rather than customization. So you don't really have that sense of personal ownership over these characters. They're just pretty much characters you collect during the game, and they join the squad. They all have different traits, and they all have new and interesting abilities they can use that makes them different, but you lose that personal touch of customization that you had in the previous XCOM games. I'm absolutely fine with them doing this if the characters that are pre-made for you to use in XCOM Chimera Squad are interesting characters. You know, they have a story to tell. They're going to be maybe a lot more talkative and a lot more personal, but yeah, they're not really. They're actually quite lame, I gotta be honest. One of the biggest downsides to XCOM Chimera Squad is the characters. Not only is the dialogue with these characters really, really cheesy. I mean, it is Saturday morning cartoon kind of stuff, but like sometimes some of the stuff is just like, why did you have to say that? You know, it's cringy, and it's just too much at points in this game that it's like, I didn't have a personal favorite character. I think the only character I really liked is someone that I really enjoyed their abilities, but in terms of a character, and I know that they replaced the squad with characters that are voiced now and they have their own kind of personality traits, I guess. But really, they don't really in this game. They are just characters that are pre-made for you to use. And yes, they have personalities, and yes, they talk a lot more than I guess in XCOM 2 with your soldiers you would customize. But man, they are not likable at all. And they're just really cringe half the time. Having come off quite a long session of playing XCOM 2 recently, actually, because I was getting myself ready for XCOM Chimera Squad, you're going to have to really adapt to some of the changes that they do in this game, because some of it, A, frustrated me, and B, some of it I kind of like, but you still have to kind of adapt to how the playstyle works this time around. One of the biggest changes, and probably the biggest I would say from the previous XCOM games, is the addition of a timeline. Essentially what a timeline is, it's on the right hand corner of the screen. And usually in XCOM games, you move all your soldiers and get them to do their actions first. And then the enemy moves all its soldiers and it does their actions, and it goes on after that, switching back and forth between your guys and the enemy. But in Chimera Squad, the timeline changes that dramatically. In fact, what ends up happening most of the time is you move one of your characters and then the enemy moves their character, and then you move your character, another one, and then the enemy moves another character. So no longer really is it you move your whole team and then the enemy moves their team and does their actions. It's a case of you move one, I move one, you move one, I move one. Is it interesting though? I think it is. I actually quite like it because it adds a different tactical element to the scenarios you play out in Chimera Squad. There's also like powers you can use to jump ahead in the timeline. So if you have a character who's not actually going to move until about turn 6, you can use special abilities where they can jump up to the very top of the timeline, so their actual next turn is the next one coming up. And I think it makes you think about every move now. In XCOM 2, you could pretty much move your whole squad and kind of worry about the enemy later on, let's just say in terms of your turn. But with this, you have to think about the enemy pretty much on every single character's movement, which I think adds maybe a little bit more realism to XCOM, if you want to call it realistic. But either way, I did like it towards the second half of this game, I would say. Another thing they changed, which I think is going to divide people quite a bit, is they've changed the way Overwatch works, which essentially is, if people don't know, it's one of the most used actions in XCOM. Essentially, when you use Overwatch, you make your soldier wait, and once the enemy moves, in front of them or in their vision, they can take a shot at that enemy. So it's good for waiting for the enemy to do something so you have a clearer sight of them and you can take probably a better shot than you did previously. Instead, they replace it with, if I go back to a previous power in XCOM 2 called Kill Zone, where you now have a cone-shaped area where you can use Overwatch in, which means you can't really just use Overwatch, and if any enemy comes in any direction, you're fine, you can take a shot at them. This time around, you have to focus on a particular area using Overwatch. Do I like that? Obviously not, because it makes it a little bit more harder. But I think in terms of the way the timeline works in this game, if you compare it to, as I said, XCOM 2, where there's no real timeline, there's just you take your turn, the enemy takes their turn. It works a lot better than you think because of the way this game works in terms of its timeline. However, and it's another thing I kind of want to talk about, is bugs and things going wrong in this game and things not working the way you think they should be. Overwatch has been a main thing for me that just seems to not trigger a lot of the time. And I feel like it's slightly broken in this game. Slightly, I don't know for sure, but I feel like there's been a lot of times where I've used this Overwatch ability and it just doesn't trigger when you expect it to trigger. This goes for a lot of the actions that you use, especially early in the game. I recently played XCOM Chimera Squad on stream. I played the first couple of hours of it. And if you go watch that, you can see me getting more and more frustrated with how they describe the abilities and how they work in this game. They're not explained as well as they could be. Over time, I obviously realized what they're trying to do, but man, oh man, the first couple of hours are very, very just frustrated with how these new abilities work, because they didn't really explain them that well, and I thought they were one thing, and then they turned out to be something else, and then I'm like, well, what good is this for? I don't really understand it, and it took me a couple of hours to understand some of these new abilities that you have to use on these characters, because they're not really explained very well, especially in the tutorial when they kind of go through some of these abilities. They don't really give you a full sense of what they can do.
67%? Come on! It's like, she's right in front of him. What's
The invaders needed to
high cover?
and control their new subjects. For that, they provided
What high cover? What do you mean, high cover? There's no high cover going on.
Also, be prepared for missions that are incredibly small. You don't have the big open spaces like you did in XCOM 2. This time around, it's pretty much go into a building. The building's not super big, just like a standard building in an XCOM game. And you do one encounter and that's it. And then you go back to base and then you do another encounter and that's it. Most missions, I think on average, most of the missions, except the big missions that you get introduced to during the game or later on in the game, most of the missions are going to be around 5 to 10 minutes. I completed one mission in less than 5 minutes. Just one of them, but that gives you some idea of how short these missions are. So for me, Chimera Squad, and it's not really the term linear I don't want to use, because it's not really a right way to describe it, because XCOM games are linear, you know, they follow a certain story, but they have chosen character over customization, I would say, in this game a whole lot more. There's a lot less stuff you can tailor make to your preferences, I would say, and you just pretty much get given units and get given their abilities. And yes, you can choose their abilities and stuff, but like their ability tree is not wide open. But pretty much the general sense I get from the Chimera Squad is that it's a lot less of the customization you found in previous XCOM games, and it's just a more tailor-made experience that the guys at Firaxis wanted you to try out. But some of the things I liked about this game, and one of the new features is called Breach Mode. Breach Mode is exactly what it says on the can. It is a mode that you go into before you start a mission, where, say if you're entering a building, you can choose what area of the building you want to enter. Maybe it's the doors, windows, maybe it's a vent. And each of these entries has a different perk that sometimes you can get by going into them. Sometimes they're negative and sometimes they're positive. It really depends on what characters you bring with you and what equipment you have equipped at the time that lets you decide if this is going to be a good thing to use if we go through this door, or it's better to go through a window because we have this perk, because this character has explosives or something. It could be completely random, but you don't really know until you actually start a mission where is the best place to go. Sometimes you'll have missions where you only have a door to go through, and going through the door is pretty bad because there's loads of enemies there. But if you bought a key card the mission before, or in the place where you buy items now in XCOM Chimera Squad, if you bought a key card, you could use the security door that's there, but you didn't, so now you're gonna have to go through the main entrance. Listen, I like this mode a lot, but it could be a lot better, because some of the things I didn't like is that you don't really know, as I said, you don't really know the breach points until you start the mission. So you don't know what characters are the best ones to bring, and you don't know what items you need to bring so you can have a better breach. And I kind of wish before you start the mission, you could maybe do a forensic scan of the location or the map and see what the entrances were before you actually join the mission. I felt like it's a bit of a roll of a dice when you go into a mission, because the breaches could be good or bad. And it really just does depend on what characters you have and what items they have equipped. It's a little bit of a negative, but I do in general like this new breach mode. I think they should definitely include it in the next XCOM game for sure. I think overall Chimera Squad is a solid new experience to the XCOM series. I don't think it's bad or anything like that. I just think it's it's going to be very different from the previous XCOM games, and that may frustrate people because they're so used to how XCOM 2 especially played. But there are some things that I feel that I really hope they don't remove from the future XCOM games. If Chimera Squad is a small snapshot into what the next XCOM is going to be, there's a couple of things I'm worried about. The main thing I'm worried about is this character over customization. In fact, some of the characters in XCOM 2 were actually quite interesting, a lot more interesting than Chimera Squad was, and Chimera Squad is very character focused. And XCOM 2 was, as I said, customization over character, more or less. But the whole linear setup with this thing, with the characters, and also something I forgot to mention is that when one of these characters dies, it's pretty much game over. You can't let any character die, else you have to restart the mission. And in previous XCOM games, that was a big part of XCOM, was your characters dying, these characters that you probably hold on for ages, and oh my god, they've been shot, they're dead, they're gone forever. And it's that shock and that horror that made XCOM games so good, because you're just so nervous to go into missions, especially difficult missions. With Chimera Squad, that goes away. That part of it is gone. And for me, that's a huge part of why I love XCOM games. Hopefully they can make tweaks to the new features that they presented here and maybe have them in XCOM 3, because that's what I would like to see. Some of the features, as I said before, they're good to okay, but they can be a lot better. And if they could tweak them to be a lot better, I think they'd be a great addition to the new XCOM whenever that comes out. So overall, I'm going to give XCOM Chimera Squad a 7.5 out of 10.